Okay, thanks for hanging in there with me. Some bonus round things, a few bits of bobs that I think are also helpful. I want to go back to the Enneagram for a minute and fill this system out a little bit more. We're going to look at it from a couple of different angles, and then I'm going to come back to discussing a little more in depth this question of psychedelics, particularly 5-MeO-DMT, that God molecule, which is indescribable, but it again, this is sort of the rocket fuel for psychological, spiritual, and personal development, especially when we pair it with the other three categories of, say, psilocybin and MDMA. But let's come back to maybe have a little more fun with this concept of the Enneagram, something I should have mentioned earlier. One way to think about the Enneagram, to think about your ego structure, it's like the car that you are driving around in. Now, every car is unique. We all have a different year, make, model, but there's only so many ways that you can design a car and still have it be a car, right? And in the same manner, there's only so many ways you can design an ego and still have it be a human ego consciousness. So, for example, if we come back here to our 9 Enneagram types, let's start here with the 8, the challenger, who has that fear of being harmed, really pushing out against the world. They're kind of like the Hummer, right? It's like driving around in a Humvee. It's kind of the tank of human consciousness. And the thing about a Hummer is you want to be careful about it because it's not going to fit in a compact spot. And then, for example, the perfectionist might be like the Tesla, right? Of ego conscious. Everything's got to be perfect, exact, precise. We might call the peacemaker the hippie bus. Now, that doesn't mean you're a liberal. That doesn't mean you're, a hippie exactly. But you're, as a metaphor for the peacemaker, they want everyone to be on the bus, everyone to be calm, everyone to be happy. Everything's calm and chill. The helper might be like an ambulance. They're always running around trying to fix everything and help everybody and solve everybody's problems in order to assuage their fear of being unloved. Number 3, the performer, right? They're like the race car, right? The sports car of ego consciousness. The individualist, we might call this the custom car, right? Totally unique. Everything's got to be tricked out in their own special way. You're going to look, when that custom car comes whizzing by, you're going to stop and take a look, right? The investigator, we may call the subcompact, like the compact car. They're very reserved, very efficient, very they really pull inside themselves. They try not to take up a lot of space. They can be very powerful intellectually, but in terms of they're not the ones who are going to be grabbing your attention driving down the highway. The loyalist, that's kind of like the family sedan of egos. Very safe, very reliable, very dependable. They're going to have all the safety features. They're going to have the jumper cables in the trunk. They're going to have their emergency water supplies, blankets, and everything you could possibly need for any possible emergency that might arise. And they're going to be hyper prepared for that emergency not to happen in the first place. And so it's just kind of a playful way of understanding what the different ego structures might look like. But the problem is that you can't see the car you're driving around in. You can see everyone else's car and what they look like and what they're doing, but you're blind to the one that you're driving around in. And what I like about the car metaphor is you can take your car anywhere you want, right? It's not deterministic about where you're going to go in life or where you're going to journey to or how you're going to travel or what you want to store in the trunk of your car or what passengers you want to pick up along the way. It just tells you what are you driving around in. And the reason that's important is you don't want to try to park a Hummer in a subcompact spot. you probably don't want to take your race car, off-roading where you would take a Hummer, right? Each of these has their area of expertise and their comfort zone, right? And if you put the wrong type into the wrong situation, then things are going to go weird really fast. Now let me touch very briefly on this idea of integration and disintegration within the Ennea type. Because you don't ever change your type. Your basic fear never changes. Your basic motivation and driver doesn't change. What changes with integration and disintegration is your stress level that your Ennea type is creating for you. So in the classical system, I'm still going to draw this on a circle, right? But let's just talk about 3 points that are really easy to discuss. We'll talk about the type 9, the type 3, and the type 6. So in the classical Enneagram system, there's these lines of integration and disintegration that we connect. And so the arrows, the red arrows are your disintegration. So 3 disintegrates to 9, 9 disintegrates to 6, and 6 disintegrates to 3. And then we just reverse those for integration. So when things are going well, the 3 integrates to 6, the 6 integrates to 9, and the 9 integrates to 3. But it's really, let's just talk about the 3, for example. The 3, right, we need to look at what the core virtues of the 3 are. Or the core, let's say, how to put it. When you disintegrate, your ego fixation, right, which in the case of the 3, the ego fixation for the 3 is vanity. So because they're the race car and the performer, they're trying to assuage this inner sense of worthlessness. And so the ego, the spiritual heroin, the crack for the 3 is in order to stop feeling worthless, is they try to make themselves look good in the eyes of everyone else. And to do that, they engage in the sort of this ego fixation of vanity. Look at me, aren't I great? But the problem with vanity is the sin, or what we call the cardinal sins, the 7 deadly sins, which are actually 9, in the typical way of starting out the understanding of the Enneagram. What feeds that vanity is the core vice of the 3, which is deceit. So, is that an I or an E? Deceit. Can't spell. So deceit is what you use to create your vanity as a 3, which assuages your fear of being worthless. Okay? So this is sort of your path down into hell as a 3. And this vanity and deceit is what ultimately causes most of the suffering for the 3, either directly or indirectly. But their spiritual path upward, right, in order, if they want to sort of move up the levels of health, the opposite of vanity, of course, then is humility. That's the spiritual practice that the 3 needs to engage in, so they overcome the vanity and move up into their virtue. And the virtue of the 3 is the opposite of deceit, which is truthfulness and authenticity. Okay. So this is the spiritual path up. This is the spiritual path down for the 3. But when we look at integration and disintegration, what's really happening when you disintegrate to the 9 for the 3, it's like this race car is running, it's going so fast, the engine is starting to burn out, that you're so busy chasing the next success, performing for everyone else, not yourself, trying to make everyone, you become this chronic people pleaser for the rest of the world, that essentially the engine starts to overheat. And your ego doesn't want to die. See, this is the key insight. The ego doesn't want to die. The ego fixation on vanity and the sin of deceit are starting to destroy the three. So when they disintegrate, what's happening is the three is borrowing the cardinal sin, or the vice of the ego type that's most opposite from them, right? Or sorry, the nine, right? The three disintegrates to the nine. So what's the cardinal sin? What's the vice of the nine is sloth, right? And so the opposite, what happens is the race car essentially borrows the vice of the nine temporarily. It takes on the sloth of the nine, so the race car can basically park in a pit stop until the engine can cool down. It needs a break. Like if it keeps racing, it's going to burn out and destroy itself. So when it gets to that stress point, it borrows the sin of the nine, the sloth, to counteract all the negative effects that this vanity and deceit is imposing on the ego of the three, and it takes a break. It just sits on the couch and parks itself until it can recharge and get healthier again and get on its way and start racing some more. Now, when we integrate, for example, when the 3 goes to 6, it's not crossing the Enneagram. This is the big conceptual flaw. It's like, oh, you're going from 3, you're jumping across the Enneagram to becoming a type 6? No, you just look like a 6 for a little while, because what the great virtue of the 6, right, the loyalist, right, if this is the loyalist, then the virtue of the 6, right, is courage, for one thing, but what you're doing is you're borrowing the best traits of the 6 when you integrate, because what happens with the 3, with the race car, when it's relaxed, it's zipping along, it's driving along great, it's passing all, it's in the fast lane cruising, and it's having a good time, right? It's being relatively humble, it's being honest and authenticity, and things are coming along really well for the 3. But the 3 has a high propensity for narcissism and selfishness and self-centeredness, because all this vanity and deceit, it's all about look at me, look at me, look at me. So the race car, it's like when things are going well, it gets a little boring being a 3, zipping around all by yourself. So what the 3 does when it's relaxed, it borrows the loyalty of the 6, and it integrates that. And essentially what the 3 does is just starts picking up passengers. It's really boring zipping around by yourself. Way more fun is to have some friends in the car next to you. And those friends could be political systems, religious systems, actual people, but you start becoming loyal, right? You have the loyalty of the 6, and you start looking more like a 6 in your point of integration, but you're still a 3. Right? You borrow the virtue of the 6 when you're integrating, things get boring, and you borrow the vice of the 9 when you're disintegrating, when things get really stressful. Because think about it like this: if you could just rest yourself into enlightenment, that's what would kind of happen if you didn't sort of take on another virtue to kind of make things interesting for yourself, to keep the game of the ego going, is what you're doing. It's a positive move, it's a forward step for the 3, but what you're really doing is keeping the ego game in play in a little more interesting way, so you don't just kind of relax yourself into enlightenment by sitting on a beach, drinking margaritas, and just have the beatific vision because everything's going well, right? It's almost like another way your ego keeps going and keeps the game in play. And we could do that all the way around the Enneagram and look at each Enneagram type and see how when it's disintegrating, it's borrowing the vice of a different Enneagram type when it disintegrates to keep the ego from destroying itself, or it's borrowing the virtue of another Enneagram type, the one that's the vice that's most opposite it, and the virtue that's most opposite that type is what integration and disintegration is really all about, right? So we could look at every single type that way, but I'll pause there so we don't go too long. Let me get to the more interesting part. Let me erase this, and let me show you another model for understanding the Enneagram that, again, when we talked at the beginning of the first video about how drawing it on a circle versus the nonagon, it reveals other potential possibilities for a conceptual framework for understanding the Enneagram. So, here's a what if. What if the Enneagram, it's not only not a nonagon, it's not a 9-pointed pentagon, it's a circle, but what if that circle is actually a cross-section of a cone? So, I can't draw a cone very well, but bear with me. But if I could draw a cone, if this is the base of the cone, here's the peak coming up. Right? And then I'll draw this sort of imaginary line down the middle. This is sort of the vertex. There's like a little right angle here. So this is, if you can imagine this as a 3D shape, a conical structure. Then the Enneagram is actually a cross-section of this cone. And this part here, we'll call this, at this stage, this is your, let's just call this the dark night, or the soul. Right? This is your point of maximal separation. This is that, going back to our original diagram, where you are in conscious, the ego is developed fully, separation, right? Where you're in a state of conscious separation, and then what we're trying to get to is this point of conscious unity. This is the peak. This is universal Christ. And if we see it from this model, then the goal obviously is not to move around the circle, to go from, if you're a type 3, is not to go to 6 and to 9 and to 7 and to be all the different Enneagram types, to integrate all of them. The point is to stay in your lane, is to stay in your race car. If you're a race car, you're always a race car. The point is not to try to make the race car into a family sedan. This is never going to work, right? Instead, we might map onto this the Rizzo-Hudson levels of development of health, right? So they have 9 stages of health of each Enneagram type, which they mapped out really, really well in a book called The Wisdom of the Enneagram. It's really sort of the Bible for Enneagram enthusiasts. But they have 9 levels of development. I'm going to throw 3 more levels of development onto their model, so that gives us 12 in total. So I think there's actually 12 levels of development to get to this state, right? Of to be consistently or close as you can get to a daily mindful practice of being in conscious unity. You can't really stay at this point for very long. You can get there, but it's not a terribly functional space in terms of operating in the world. You still need your ego to be on the highway of life, right? You can't go on the highway of life without an ego structure. So here is just sort of blissed out unity, but if you can back off a little bit from there, you can get close to it and still be a functional human being. I'm nowhere near that, but I've seen some folks who seem to manage it pretty well. So there's our 12 levels of development. Okay, so there's 9, and of those 12 levels, right, we've got 9 equal the Rizzo-Hudson levels. And I'm going to add in 3 more, which are the 3 non-dualities. The three stages of non-duality. And so the 3 stages of non-duality, so we can put, we can kind of put them here. We'd say we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Sorry, I didn't space those out very well, but you get the idea. So the first 9, right? These guys, this is our Rizzo-Hudson model. But then these last 3, I think there's actually 3 types of non-duality, of non-dualistic thinking, that you have to sort of work through to get up to this level of conscious unity. And the first level here is what I would call the non-duality of the self, right? There's non-duality of the self. That's that. If we went back to the iceberg metaphor, that means your conscious, your subconscious, and your unconscious mind are in alignment. There's nothing really much mucking about in your unconscious mind, so that basically your unconscious mind and your conscious mind are not in conflict. They aren't fighting each other. You aren't saying you want one thing out of life and then doing something else that's counterproductive to what you say you want, right? There's nothing in your unconscious mind sabotaging you. Your traumas aren't tripping you up. You've forgiven them, you've healed them, you've found a way to move forward and redeem them. The second level of non-duality is the non-duality of the universe. That means that you see all of reality around you as one coherent whole. There's no separation, or the separation and divisions are a necessary illusion that you are able to sort of see past with a consistent level of wisdom and acceptance. That the universe is one undivisible whole, and you are in alignment with that flow of the universe. And then the final non-duality is the non-duality of God. And these are all very mystical states, very hard to articulate. 5-MeO will help bring you to this point, but actually I think vaporized NN-DMT helps you kind of work through this conflict, right? You kind of see the difference. NN-DMT will open you up to a whole other realm of what the universe is really like, or potentially like, which is way vaster and more wild and crazy than your imagination could ever begin to conceive of. But then you still have to go one step further and integrate all of that into the non-duality of God. All right, so then what we also have here, so we're essentially, what we're doing is we're moving up into different levels of non-duality. So we're trying to, here we're in total duality, and we're moving up to levels of non-duality is our goal. And you can't really get to the non-duality of the self, the first step of non-duality, until you've moved through, in some healthy way, all the levels of development in the Rizzo-Hudson model. But what's really interesting is this sort of brings up another interesting conceptual idea is, well, what if isn't the only part of the diagram? What if the cone extends downward as well as upward? Then we have a whole new area philosophically and conceptually to explore that we never have access to if we're thinking of the Enneagram as a nonagon, and that's it. So now in this model, what's down here, this might be our birth, right? This is when we are an unconscious unity, right? And this is where there's unconditional acceptance of you. Again, this is, and I say this with, again, there's some caveats here, but it's basically when you experience unconditional rejection of you. Now, this can take a lot of different forms. For example, it's the night when you come home and you find out that your teenage daughter was killed in a car crash. That's the universe unconditionally rejecting your greatest hopes and dreams. Your most prized possession dies. And there's nothing you can do about it. It's the day when you find out your spouse is cheating on you and leaving you. It's the day you get fired from your job. It's the day that your addictions leave you completely broken physically, mentally, and financially, and driven you into the dark night of the soul. It can take on a lot of different flavors. But where the universe or God basically says, it doesn't matter that you followed all the rules. It doesn't matter that you obeyed the 10 Commandments. It doesn't matter that you followed all the thou shalls and thou shalt nots. There's an unconditional rejection of everything that you hoped and dreamed for. And we all have to face this because we're all dying. We're all going to die. Everything that you love is going to die. Including you, yourself, the thing you value potentially more than anything else. This whole ego game is going to go away at some point. So the whole universe is structured to reject you totally, utterly, and completely at some point. This can be the day you get your terminal cancer diagnosis. When you find out you've got 2 different forms of cancer and a few months to live. Whatever it is for you, it's unconditional. And it's painful. But more importantly, just as we have levels of development here, I mean, so much brilliance went into this. I can't give enough praise to Rizzo and Hudson for coming up with these levels of development. But a whole area we haven't explored in the Enneagram community is the levels of development from birth into conscious separation. There's probably, and this is a hypothesis, just as many levels. There's a 1 through 12 here, right? We could probably do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. We could reverse it that way as well. I don't know what that looks like, but we should probably get some child psychologists and some developmental psychologists. And I'm sure some people have done this. I know people have already done this work, but mapping it more closely to the Enneagram could be a very helpful model. And then this circle, right, it stays consistent, but its radius can expand and contract. So we all start at some moment of unconscious unity, and then as our life traumas, as these unconditional no's hit us, they sort of bang us into one of these quadrants on the Enneagram. And then where we get a really interesting thing to think about is we don't all, when we get to this dark night, when we get to this point of maximal separation, we aren't all at level 12 in the Rizzo-Hudson scale. Some of us get to this point and we're at 9, or we're at 8, or we start... Some of us get to this point of adulthood, of middle age, midlife, in pretty good shape. Like, we're not all in this horrifyingly nihilistic, suicidal, homicidal point. Many of us are, but not everybody. So how do we short-circuit this path so that when you get to this transition point, you hit it at level 9 or level 8 rather than all these other ones? And so you can shorten the path. You can both shorten the path you have to take, you can reduce the trauma you have to experience, and you can accelerate the speed with which you move through all of them. And this is really interesting to any parent or teacher to think about. Well, maybe a lot of our, when people get really damaged, when people are deeply traumatized, what seems to happen is they get hit with too big of a no too soon. Or they don't get hit with big enough no's soon enough, right? So, for example, if you start here and somewhere in your childhood, whatever this level is, you start experiencing rape, incest, torture, the death of your parents, who knows, war. Well, guess what? That's going to do. It's going to sort of, it's going to increase the radius, right? This is your radius of separation, a sense of separation from your original unity. And you might expand this radius too quickly, and the trauma of that separation, of that horrifying no from the universe that comes at you at a really young age. Or it can even be a consistent no, like people who are chronically bullied, people who are chronically neglected and abused. Like, it's not just one thing that does it. It's repeat trauma is far worse, obviously, than one individual trauma. Not that any one trauma is good, but having repeat successive trauma might just keep pushing you further out until, and if this radius gets too big, well, then it just snaps, and then you're done, right? That's when you go into suicide and homicide and genocide and fratricide and everything else. That's Cain and Abel, right? Cain and Abel, think of the Cain and Abel story. What happens to Abel? Well, God rejects his offering and accepts the offering of his brother Abel. Cain is so rejected by the very ground of all being that he turns into fratricide, right? That's the story, and that's the risk, right, with consciousness. Anyway, and we could think of other metaphors that just popped into my head. But the point being is we don't need to think in 2 dimensions. We can think in 3 dimensions about the Enneagram, and that opens up who knows what new realms to be explored. And then, so this is non-duality here. This is our path into duality, right? This is how we learn to navigate duality. We're moving up into it, and then we're moving up out of it. Okay, let me finish this off with a little more depth on the God molecule, 5-MeO, MDMA. Again, onto this model, right? We don't want to be messing around with psychedelics in the developmental stage of the ego, because you have to have a strong ego first before you can let it go. And that brings me back to a point I glossed over just a second ago, which is that one of the other damaging things is not to give enough no's to a child. Right? So there's a really prevalent movement called positive parenting, which has its merits. You don't want to give the old ways, right, of spare the rod and spoil the child has a truth to it, but that got taken too far, and we just beat kids into submission, and that's we're just traumatizing them by only giving them no's, and very brutal ones at that. But there's a balance. The opposite of that isn't the opposite of that coin isn't necessarily any better, where you just say yes, and it's sort of the Hobbes versus Rousseau conception of children. The Rousseauian version is kids are beautiful and perfect and sweet and lovely and innocent, and that's true because they're unconsciously in unity when they start, and there's a beauty about that, but it does kind of need to get beaten out of you a little bit, and we shouldn't be abusing children physically. Physical violence is never appropriate, but some of the most damaged souls I encountered during my almost 20 years as a classroom teacher were the kids who never got no's from their parents. They never really develop. There's still so much in this unconditional acceptance of you that this is total narcissism, right? You need to go through this so you stop being such a narcissistic, selfish, self-centered child who thinks everything's about you. You're the center of the universe, which is what you experience at birth. Everything's about you. And it needs to be for the first year or two. But eventually you need to start thinking of other people and developing self-control, because one of the benefits of this process is free will, right? The whole point, one of the many points of this process is to develop free will. And when you have free will, you're not governed by your random passions that pop up in every desire. You have the free will to choose love, right? So love requires an act of choice. Love cannot be coerced. It has to be freely given and freely received. And if you don't develop an appropriate level of free will, you never develop the capacity for love, and you never develop the capacity for conscious unity in love with all. So we could talk about that a lot. That's worthy of a whole lecture, I think. I won't torture you too much with that right now. Okay, I keep trying to get back to 5-MeO. I'm sorry, I get distracted with these other thoughts. But let's map onto this. So again, never introduce psychedelics in the developmental stage of an ego, but then when it needs loosening up, this is where we can add in this in this space, this transition spot, right? This is where our psilocybin comes in. This is where LSD and DMT are most useful, right? Because these are all unconscious childhood wounds that allow consciousness to form. And then we need to consciously heal those wounds. Heal the wounds that created our consciousness. I would say conscious or self-consciousness, right? Now, and then this, of course, is where MDMA is so helpful. I'm going to try a different marker. It might be a little darker. That one's a little light. So this is where MDMA is so useful. And this is, of course, where 5-MeO is so helpful. Now, a couple of thoughts about 5-MeO and the Enneagram. What's really interesting about it is that if you know someone's Enneagram type before they journey on 5-MeO, you're going to have a really good sense of where they're going to struggle in that journey. And you're also going to have a really good roadmap of how to help them integrate that very difficult experience. Because when the ego gets ripped out, I think I mentioned earlier in the other video, the last thing, what does your ego hold on to most deeply? What is the thing that's the last part to pop on a 5-MeO DMT experience. Now, in my limited anecdotal evidence, non-scientific, but so far feels very robust and is an area I think worthy of much exploration. The last thing to pop, that's your childhood wound, right? It's your deepest shame, your deepest source of anger or fear. It's not always self-evident because everyone's story is unique, everyone's life journey is unique, everyone's trauma is unique. But how it shapes them kind of pulls them into one of these archetypes. And then, if you know the person, you got to know the person well. And you need to really help them sit down to figure out after the journey's over to really understand it. But nonetheless, you now have a roadmap with the Enneagram to know where they're going to struggle going into the 5-MeO experience and what it's going to be like a little bit on the other side. Because the 5-MeO, what it does is it floods you with an infinite amount of everything. Like all the positive emotions come at you. Well, all the emotions come at you through the course of the journey. But what it seems to do is fill you up completely, but you notice the filling up most acutely in the parts of your ego that are most, and your psyche that are most empty. So as a 3, I have this deep shame, this deep sense of being worthless. So the 5 will fill you up on all of these. It will pull you right up to this peak of total unity, but the shock to your system comes most deeply in that lane you're in where you feel most unworthy or most terrified or most fearful. So the going into the 5 experience, it doesn't really matter where you are on the levels of development. The 5 just takes you where you are and just pops you right here and then pops you back down. Hopefully a little higher up than when you started, and with an opportunity to move very rapidly up through these other levels if you integrate properly. And it also shows you the goal. It shows you that experience of what it's really like, of where you're trying to get to, and what your birthright is, was, and always will be. Your original state of unity. And sorry, I lost my thought there. And so as you run up to this peak experience, what it forces you to confront very rapidly, and sometimes it happens so rapidly you can't even process it, which is fine, but it seems to, especially on your first journey with 5-MeO, the first time you do it, this seems to be revealed more obviously than on some of the subsequent journeys, although it's certainly there too, in my limited experience, is that what you confront on the run-up is your greatest fear, and then what you get on the backside is the fulfillment of your greatest hope. Right? So your greatest hope within your Enneatype is just the converse of your greatest fear. So, for example, if you're, a 7 and your fear is of being in pain or privation, it's really scary getting up there. You can feel a tremendous amount of pain that you're and not fun, but on the flip side, it's total fulfillment. Right? It is total contentment, totally in the present moment. You don't need to be hyper planning for the next thing because you're in total fulfillment in the present moment. There's nothing lacking. There's no privation at all. So your fear is fulfilled, and then you are content in that resolution of your fear, and with the fulfillment of your greatest hope. And then that hopefully also lets you move faster up the levels of development through the practice and this is a side note. Let me finish this thought, and I'll come back to this new one. So again, the 5-MeO seems to make you confront your greatest fear on the run-up to the moment, and then fulfills that with your greatest hope on the backside. And that's really useful if you're going to guide somebody on 5-MeO, because then when they come back and have to process, like, what was that? Like, whew. And to make sense of it and integrate it and have a healthy relationship to it, you can now guide them through that experience. You have a bit of a roadmap, right, to work through it. And then that second thought I wanted to share was maybe the other part of the Enneagram that I think is really missing is the spiritual practice of each type. So once you know the greatest fear, you know the greatest hope, you know the virtue and the vice, and those have been laid out pretty well by others. But then I would pair each one of these with a spiritual practice. Let me just read them off really quickly. I don't think I have them memorized. But very quickly, say for type 1, right? Their spiritual practice, well, their vices. Oh, I'm looking at type 3, so I'll come back to 3. So for type 3, right? As we discussed earlier, their vice is deceit. Their virtue is truthfulness and authenticity. But then the spiritual practice of the 3 is going to be humility. Right? They need to practice humility to overcome their vanity. Let's just see if I can go in order. Then type 2, I'm just kind of grabbing these in no particular order. Type 2, right, they feel unloved, so they hope to feel loved. So on the 5-MeO, you can bet if you're a 2, you're probably going to be filled with this. We all get filled with it, but what you're going to acutely come away with perhaps is this deep, deep sense of total love and acceptance that you've always been looking for. But then that helps you when your spiritual practice, which is always going to be honesty, right? Because you're addicted to flattery. This is going to be kind of quick. I should probably do a separate video with all of these. It would make more sense, but I'll just go very quickly through them. Type 1, if I can find my notes. Let me put these away. Type 1 being the perfectionist, right? Then what their spiritual practice is always going to be gratitude, because their addiction is resentment, right? Their anger makes them resentful, and so then they need to practice gratitude. But once they've been on the 5, they've had their greatest hope fulfilled. They have this serenity, this sense of knowing that they're fundamentally good as they are in full integrity, and have integrity just as they are. Now they can practice gratitude, and that practice of more easily, and that practice of gratitude is what's going to move them up on the spiritual levels of development. And then if we look at 9, let's see if I can find 9. Where are you, 9? The back of the bus. So number 9, right? If your vice is sloth, if you're a 9, and you feel loss of wholeness, if you journey on 5-MeO, then what you're likely to experience is complete and total wholeness, right? And complete peace of mind, and that sense of completion, which then allows you to have a certain amount of assertiveness now. You're not so slothful because you've had a sense of wholeness, a divine wholeness, right? Your 9 brought you up to that peak, dumps you back down, but now you've had a moment where your fear is completely resolved temporarily. But you can now go out in the world and practice assertiveness and be a force for real good in the world, rather than sitting on your backside and being a couch potato. And then for number 8, right, the challenger, if your fears of being harmed, then you're likely to have on 5-MeO a moment of total innocence and simplicity. You're going to feel divine total mercy. And so then you can your spiritual practice for the 8 to move you up through these levels of development is going to be mercy, right? Because you felt that total innocence, that acceptance, that love that's coming at you, and then you no longer have to be you're no longer afraid of being harmed or controlled or annihilated. I will say, in my limited experience, 8s have a very hard time on 5-MeO because their greatest fear is of being annihilated. And that's exactly what the 5 does, is it annihilates you. So if you're an 8, just a warning, you might have a little more difficulty. It's never easy for anybody, but 8s seem to have a bit more of a rough time of it than others. Then if you're a 7, right, you're the enthusiast. Again, we talked about that a little bit, but you're going to likely to have complete fulfillment. And so now you can engage in your virtue, which is sobriety, which really means being in the present moment. You're not running to the next thing, running to the next thing. You can be fully in the present moment, fully fulfilled. Now, it isn't necessarily super obvious that this is what's happening on your 5-MeO experience, but if you dig below it, I bet you'll... This is a hypothesis to be continually tested. Maybe let's put it that way. This is something that, a very nascent idea that needs a lot more crowdsourcing to be verified. But so far, in my limited anecdotal evidence, has held up. So I'm putting it out there for the psychedelic community to explore and see what you all think about it. We'll go around here to 6. Then we've got the loyalist. You're addicted to fear. And so then what you're likely to have is this infinite sense of connectedness, of support, of you're safe in the world. You are ultimately, eternally safe. And so now you can have courage. You can practice your virtue of courage. And your virtue is courage, but your practice for the 6 is faith. So that's something, again, the spiritual practice of each type is going to be unique to your type, which is a quick sidebar, which is why religion is so weird, because we have all these different practices within our different faith traditions, but you need to pair the right spiritual practice to your Enneagram type. And what you are most tempted to do is pick the spiritual practice that most reinforces your ego fixation, not the one that's going to annihilate it or diminish it. So the 8 and the 9 is a really good example. So the 9 is the peacemaker. So there's this famous line in the Bible where Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers." Well, who is that quote aimed at? It's not for the 9s. The 9s don't need more peace. The 9s need assertiveness and conflict. They need to face, they need to have the fight so they can find harmony, not this weirdness that they end up in by refusing to engage in conflict. So for 9s, the spiritual practice is the line where Jesus says, "I come not to bring peace, but I come to bring a sword. I come to separate father from child, mother from son." Whatever that. Forgive my biblical quotations; they're terrible. But the idea that Christ brings a sword, that is for the practice of the 9. Blessed are the peacemakers. That's the practice for the 8, right? But the 8 is likely to fixate on the "I come to bring a sword" and feel very virtuous about that. The 9 is going to fixate on blessed are the peacemakers and fixate on that, and the whole thing gets muddled, right? Because both the Bible or the Quran or any of our religious texts, they need to be able to have a practice embedded in their system that talks to every single Enneatype. So anyway, but moving on. So the practice of the 6, of course, is going to be courage. 5-MeO can help with that. And then we'll move on here to the 4. The 5, the investigator, right? So they want to be capable, they want to be competent, they're addicted to stinginess, they have avarice, right? Is sort of the vice, we call it, or the sin. I like vice more than sin. Sin is such a triggering word for me and for many people. But then they can have, their virtue, of course, is going to be non-attachment, but then their spiritual practice of the 5 is going to be generosity. Right? So the 5 MEO will fill the 5 Enneatype 5 up with so much abundance that there's no more need for them to be so stingy. And they can be more readily practicing their practice of generosity of time, generosity of knowledge, generosity of talent, of affection, whatever they need, whatever their particular practice is, how it manifests for them. And then, of course, for 4s, right? So their vice is envy. They're always addicted to melancholy. But their practice for the 4, the spiritual practice for the 4, is going to be joy. And in their joy, that's going to counteract their melancholy and lead them to equanimity and emotional balance. And so, if you want joy, 5 MEO is going to help them with that, right? It's going to make them it's going to assuage this fear of not having a unique identity, to know that they are supremely special in the grand divine mystery of the cosmos. And their ultimate identity is God itself. And there's nothing more wonderful or unique or special than that, right? So once this fear gets even temporarily assuaged, now they can practice joy more readily and move themselves up with a little bit more speed onto the levels of health and development. Okay, that was a little slapdash, but you get the idea. I'm going kind of quick. I think I've hit all my key points, but I think I'll stop there, and if there's, please reach out to me if you have questions. If anyone wants to contact me, let me just put my email up here on the board. You can reach me at doug@douglynham.com. That's my email. Please reach out. I would love criticism. Like, I'm putting this out there to stress test it. So what I'm asking you to do is take these ideas and smash them with the biggest intellectual hammers that you can find. And let me know where it breaks. And let me know how I can improve it. What have I missed? Because I know it's incomplete. I know it's nascent. But I think there's something here worthy of exploration that can be turned into a psychotherapeutic model, a spiritual model for really solving people's deepest struggles and alleviate suffering, which is our goal, right? So we can live in Christ consciousness, live in unity, live in love, live in freedom, live in joy, both individually and collectively. And I don't see how we're going to get there with the current models we have, because nothing seems to be working. Our society is falling apart. Our families are falling apart. Our communities are falling apart. Our churches are falling apart. Our political systems are falling apart. And that's not all bad. It's an opportunity. It's a bit of a dark night of the soul for our civilization. With climate crisis, with everything else, coronavirus, we're all feeling it. I don't think any of us are in denial about how easy it is to feel despair right now about where the world is going. And I realize that many of these ideas are radical. I realize I'm pushing both the legal boundaries and the religious boundaries and many other, probably touching on many taboos by bringing these ideas of psychedelics into our spiritual practice as Christians or as Buddhists or whatever you are. But I think if we can do it with some grace and some dignity and some mindfulness, then there's a potential, there's a possibility here that I don't think any of us can really foresee where this is going. But I have no doubt that this is the future of psychotherapy. This is the future of spirituality, to give people the experience of God, to give people the experience of themselves as God incarnate. their birthright. That's what we have to give people. And that's what our religious traditions have been trying to do for millennia. But we need an operating system update, because our religion has two functions, as Ken Wilber has pointed out, as Richard Rohr has pointed out. Religion has two functions. It has the first half of life function, the thou shalts and thou shalt nots. But then it has this transcendent function. And we don't really have good models, which is, again, what the rites of passage that Richard was coming up with, right? The wisdom pattern, the sign of Jonah, it's helping us get through this transition point individually, but we're also at this transition point as a civilization. And if we don't make that leap, well, then we're going to blow out, right? The radius of our civilization, we're pulling farther and farther and farther and farther and farther apart into conscious separation. Republicans, Democrats, liberals, conservatives, Russians, Ukrainians, Chinese Americans, right? Buddhists, Christians. We're all finding we're separating. You separate too much, it breaks apart. And the cracks are there. We all see the cracks. And it's sad. But it's an opportunity. It's not a point of despair. We can't stay in despair. We need to use that despair, that darkness, we have to go through it, not back out of it, right? Not shy away from it, not be scared of it. The only way is through. If we try to back down, let's go back to the old ways, right? It's not going to work. Not individually, not collectively. So this is a potential new way. And I don't know what it means. I don't know how to I don't know. I just want to be honest about what I don't know, and that's pretty much everything. But this makes sense to me. This seems like something worthy of further exploration. And also, I think most importantly, for me personally, there's so much wisdom here in the greatest hits of Richard Rohr. It's just miraculous what he achieved in one lifetime. And I want to honor that lineage. And I want to see where we can take it to the next level. And maybe give him a little hope as he makes his final journey in this life. So, I love you all. Thank you for listening. If you made it this far, I'm amazed. Thank you for your patience. And please reach out if you have questions or feedback. I need it. Love you.